Well, good afternoon and welcome to this latest installment of our Living Tradition series. This has been an ongoing series throughout this program year affected by the pandemic, where instead of celebrating our 30th anniversary of regular choral evensongs with evensong, we've been taking a detour into other aspects of liturgy and music, specifically as they relate to St. Peter's. And so today's presentation by Mr. Bruce Ryder does relate to something that goes on at St. Peter's quite a bit and has for many, many years. And that is the Doxology, which is a familiar hymn text, Praise God from whom all blessings flow, that has been written by Thomas Ken. And he's the subject of Bruce's talk. So Bruce is a member of the St. Peter's Choir, sings in the tenor section, and I've known him that way primarily, but I also began to know that he had an interest in the life and times of Thomas Ken and has done a considerable amount of research. So I'm hoping that Bruce will maybe humor us with a little bit of rationale and background into how he got into researching Thomas Ken. So Bruce, welcome and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, David. I was a history and French major in college, and in one of my history courses on British constitutional history, I wrote a paper about the trial of the 7 bishops, which I will be speaking about later on, which was sort of the climactic moment of Bishop Ken's political career. And the name stuck in my head. And many years later, while I was singing at St. Peter's sometime in the 1990s or early 2000s, I just while not listening to a sermon one day, wondered who wrote the doxology that we had just sung. And so I looked in the hymnal and saw the name Thomas Ken, and it triggered something in my memory. So I realized that it was in fact one of the bishops who had been the participants, the defendants in the 7 bishops trial. And that piqued my curiosity. And the more I read about Bishop Ken, the more interesting he became, and the more interesting the time in which he lived became to me, because it was in many ways a seminal period, both in British constitutional and social history, and leading up to the philosophies that formed the foundation for American constitutional history. I won't have time to go into all of that in any detail today, but I will try to cover as much as I can in something approximating an hour as possible. So let me see if I can pull this up. There, can everybody see that? Okay. So this is the text that we all sing or hear every Sunday. This is a recording of the St. Peter's Choir from February of 2000. So as David mentioned, the man who wrote those words was Thomas Ken, who lived from 1637 until 1711. He served as a bishop in the Church of England for a short period of time during his life. He was born in July of 1637. He was the sixth of the 9 children of his parents, Thomas and Martha Ken. Of those 9, only 4 survived infancy, and Thomas was the youngest of those. He also had 2 much older half-sisters from his father's first marriage. Thomas's father was a lawyer. He specialized in judicial administration. He served as a clerk to the Sheriff of London and also as the chief clerk for the courts in 3 counties in South Wales. When Thomas was 3 in 1640, his mother died, giving birth to his youngest sibling, who also died a few days later. About that time, Thomas's father added a 3rd job, which was as one of the assistant clerks to the House of Lords in Parliament. And this was a particularly eventful time to be working for Parliament, because the Parliament that was called in 1640 was the first Parliament that had been called by King Charles I in over a decade. And the Parliament that sat was very much at odds with King Charles over taxation and over religious issues. And matters deteriorated quickly to the point that civil war broke out in 1642. And while many members of both the House of Lords and House of Commons left London to follow the king, Parliament as an institution remained in London, and Thomas's father continued to work as a clerk for the Parliament. The war did not go well for the king. The parliamentary armies defeated the king, and primarily because Parliament controlled London and did so throughout. Parliament, both sides tried to raise taxes to support their efforts. Parliament, again, was more successful, particularly in London, but Ken's father petitioned the Parliament to ask that he be excused from paying his taxes, in part because of the burdens of his large family, and in part because the war had destroyed his clerkship practice in South Wales, which had been apparently the bulk of his income. And this is the petition that Ken's father submitted to Parliament asking for the waiver. The waiver was granted. As I said, Parliament won the war, and in January of 1649, put the king on trial. King Charles refused to acknowledge the authority of Parliament or any human court to try him, taking the position that under the theory of the divine right of kings, no human had the right to judge him, only God did. Parliament didn't buy that argument, convicted him of treason, and executed him on the 30th of January, 1649. Shortly after that, Parliament put Ken's father out of a job by abolishing the House of Lords. Ken's father died 2 years later. While Ken's father worked for Parliament, it's not at all clear that he was doing so out of philosophy or doing so out of financial necessity. A couple of things indicate it might have been the former. One was that one of his older daughters, Anne, married a man by the name of Isaac Walton, who was a definitely a royalist. It's not clear how the families knew each other, but Walton was a remarkable man in his own right. He was self-educated, but he attended a church where in London, where John Donne was the rector. Through his friendship with John Donne, he became a friend of many of the leading priests in the 1630s, and started writing biographies of members of that circle. Walton is probably most famous for having written The Complete Angler during the 1650s, which is ostensibly a fishing manual, but in fact is a meditation on how to live a contemplative life in difficult circumstances, which certainly was the case for royalists in London, in England in the 1650s. The other thing that indicates that Thomas Ken's father may not have been wedded to the principles of the Parliament was that he enrolled his son at Winchester College, which was set up as a college for educating young men to go into the priesthood. It was originally founded in the late 1400s, the late 14th century, the late 1300s, by William of Wykeham, who was Bishop of Winchester and Chancellor of the realm. He set it up as a grammar school to feed into another institution that he founded, New College at Oxford. Wykeham, who was a man of from a very modest background, who had risen to become a bishop and chancellor, saw even in the late 1300s the need to provide education for young men similar to him in order to continue to have people available for the priesthood. So the fact that Thomas Ken's father sent him to a school to be trained to become a priest at a time when the priesthood was not something that Parliament certainly was much of a fan of, would tend to indicate that his father's inclinations may have lain elsewhere. In any event, Ken was enrolled at Winchester College as a commoner, meaning he had to pay his own way at some point in 1650 or 1651. He was elected to become a scholar, which meant that his way was paid in September of 1651, shortly after his father's death. Ken was old to be a scholar there, but again, it may have been because of his father's circumstances. There was also some familial connection to Winchester College. One of the fellows there appears to have been a cousin of Ken's mother. But in any event, Winchester College was called a grammar school. The grammar that was at issue was Latin grammar, not what we think of today as grammar school. It was necessary for students who wanted to attend Oxford to be well grounded in Latin because Latin was the language in which all the courses at Oxford and Cambridge were taught. So if you didn't know it, you couldn't really get anything out of the university. Ken attended Winchester College for 5 years. After 4 years, he took the exam to qualify for admission to New College. The examination was very rigorous. It was a 3-day examination where all of the candidates were assembled before a panel of 6 fellows, 3 from New College and 3 from Winchester College. And the first 2 days, they were given texts from classical Latin to translate. The 3rd day, each of them was given a subject at the discretion of one of the examiners and was required to compose, without the benefit of pen and paper, Latin verses on the subject given by the examiner. The first time that Ken took the exam in 1655, he ranked 9th on the exam. And that was significant because admission to New College was restricted. There was a limited number of people of young men who could attend. And if there weren't vacancies, they could only take the number for whom there were vacancies. And ranking 9th, he did not make admission that year. He took the exam the next year and ranked 4th. Even then, he had to wait. The examination was held in September. He had to wait until the following year to finally get a place at New College. He had attended Oxford in the interim, but again, not being part of the college, he had to pay his own way until he was admitted. So let's see, here's the record from the official register from Winchester College showing his admission as a scholar in 1651. Here is the record of his examination in 1656, showing his 4th place ranking. And then here's a picture of New College as it existed in 1675, which is very close to the time when Ken attended. While at Oxford, Ken studied liberal arts. He may very well have also studied modern languages. Certainly his library indicated that his library contained a number of books in Spanish and French, indicating that presumably he could read those languages, and he might have studied that while he was there. Ken's education occurred during the 1650s, which was during the interregnum, the period between kings. England during that period was ruled primarily by Oliver Cromwell, who was essentially a dictator during the period. Cromwell had done away with the bishops altogether, and the church was essentially in the model of a Presbyterian or congregational churches. Cromwell died in 1658, leaving a power vacuum. His son took over as Lord Protector for a few months, but resigned because he simply lacked the authority to rule. Another general stepped in to try to take over, but finally, General George Monk who was the governor of Scotland, brought his army down from Scotland, convened a convention which summoned Charles II, the son of the executed Charles I, from the continent, and declared that he should be recognized as having been king since the death of his father. When Charles, and here is Charles as he looked late in his reign, when Charles became king, he convened a new parliament, which was very heavily in his favor, they reconstituted the Church of England along the lines that it had existed prior to the Civil War, reinstituted the bishops. One of the men who worked with Charles in reconstituting the church was a man by the name of George Morley. George Morley, upon the Restoration, rose very quickly from being Dean of Christ Church, Oxford, to being Bishop of Worcester, to being Bishop of Winchester, which was one of the most prestigious and wealthy dioceses in the country. George Morley was also a close friend of Isaac Walton. And immediately upon returning to England from exile and taking up his position in the church, he brought Walton into his household, and along with his connection to Walton, obviously then also established a connection to young Master Ken. Thomas Ken was ordained as a priest at some point in 1662. The records do not reflect where or by whom. I think it's likely that Bishop Morley probably ordained him, but certainly by 1663, a year later, Thomas Ken was a protege of Bishop Morley's. Here is a letter from Thomas Ken to the warden of New College, where he had been continued to serve as a fellow after graduating from the university in 1661 with his bachelor's degree. In this letter, Ken tells the warden that he was with the Bishop of Winchester and had intercepted a messenger who was bringing a letter from the warden. Ken relays Bishop Morley's reply and then goes on to say, I need to ask for a leave from the college because I am going to, my absence is being procured by the bishop so please excuse me. A couple of weeks later, Thomas Ken was made rector of a parish in Essex, the parish of Little Easton, which was probably almost certainly, given what's said in this letter, a position that was procured for him by Bishop Morley. The actual patron of the parish of Little Easton was William Lord Maynard, and Ken developed a close tie during the couple of years that he was there, both with Lord Maynard and with his wife, Lady Margaret. And indeed, it appears that he remained Lady Margaret's spiritual advisor during the rest of her life, and was asked to return to Little Easton to preach her funeral sermon when she died in 1682. Let's see. From Little Easton, Bishop Morley summoned Thomas Ken to come to Winchester in 1665, and shortly thereafter, Ken was elected to be a fellow of Winchester College. The fellows, there were 10 fellows of the college. They were responsible for basically the governance of the college and administering the many properties with which the college had been endowed by William of Wykeham. He also served as Bishop Morley's personal chaplain, one of his two personal chaplains, and also shortly after being elected to be a fellow of Winchester College, he was also instituted by Bishop Morley as one of the canons or prebendaries of Winchester Cathedral. Ken took his position as a fellow of Winchester College very seriously, and in 1674 he published a manual of prayers for the scholars there that he had may have been used before then. This is a copy of the 8th edition title page, but it had in fact begun in 1674. Let's see. Ken also volunteered as a supply priest, if you will, at one of the churches in Winchester, which was too poor to afford a full-time priest. So he kept himself busy in Winchester during this period. Also, as Bishop Morley's chaplain, he would accompany Bishop Morley to London when business called him there, which it frequently did, given his position in the church and his close ties to King Charles. And while in London, Thomas Ken would frequently preach at a church in Chelsea near Bishop Morley's house. And there are records of, or diary entries from one person at least who attended several of the sermons that Bishop Ken, that then Father Ken, preached in Chelsea, and was greatly impressed with his eloquence and the spirituality of his preaching. Thomas Ken first entered into the political arena in England in 1679, when he was asked to serve as the personal chaplain to Princess Mary of Orange. This was a significant position because Princess Mary was the second in line to the throne of England. Her father, King Charles, although he had approximately 15 illegitimate children, had no legitimate children. His heir was his younger brother, James, Duke of York. But James had two daughters. One was Princess Mary, the other was Princess Anne. Princess Mary, at the age of 15, married William of Orange, who was the stadtholder of Holland, and who also happened to be her first cousin. Prince William was in fact the fourth in line to the throne at the time. But James, Duke of York, Mary and Anne's father, had recently announced that he was a Catholic. And it was therefore very important that chaplains of the Church of England attend Princess Mary in order to ensure that she remained close to the Church of England. Ken served as her chaplain for approximately a year. He very quickly found himself at crossways with Prince William. he did not think that Prince William was treating his wife particularly well. And then matters were further complicated by the fact that one of Prince William's hunting and drinking buddies, Count Zulestein, seduced one of Princess Mary's ladies in waiting, a woman by the name of Jane Roth, and got her pregnant. Thomas Ken's feelings about that situation may have been complicated by the fact that Jane Roth was the niece of Lady Margaret Maynard, his very close friend from his first parish. In any event, at one point while William was away from The Hague on business, Thomas Ken buttonholed Count Zulestein and either cajoled, threatened, or persuaded him to marry Jane Roth, which he did. And William, upon his return, finding that one of his boon companions was somewhat out of circulation because he was married, was furious with Ken. But nevertheless, Ken offered to resign, but nevertheless, he was permitted to stay and fill out his year. And he returned to London in 1680. As a reward for his service, he was made one of the royal chaplains, which gave him further opportunities to preach before the court in London. His next encounter with the court outside of his preaching occurred back in Winchester. King Charles had decided he wanted to build a new royal palace, something that could potentially rival Versailles, and he chose Winchester as the place where he was going to do that. He therefore started spending more time in Winchester in order to oversee the construction of the palace, which was, by the way, never completed. The court therefore had to find places for Charles and all of the people who would be accompanying him on visits to Winchester to stay. And it was decided that Charles would stay at the deanery in the Cathedral Close. Thomas Ken, as one of the canons of the cathedral, had a house in the close also. His house happened to be the house closest to the deanery. And whoever was in charge of handing out sweeping assignments decided that Bishop Ken's house was the perfect place to put Nell Gwynn, one of Charles's mistresses. Thomas Ken, however, flatly refused to permit her to sleep in his house, saying that it was not proper for a woman of ill repute to be lodged in the house of a clergyman. Some of the stories even say that he threatened to take the roof off of his house to make it uninhabitable before he would permit her to stay there. The upshot of it was that his intransigence was permitted, and the dean, who was someone of somewhat fewer scruples, had a room added on to the south end of his house, the deanery, where Nell Gwynn slept when she wasn't sleeping with Charles. The date of when this incident occurred is not recorded. the incident almost sounds apocryphal, but I've seen enough indications to point to the idea, to lead me to believe that something along those lines actually did happen. Ken's next encounter with politics came at the end of June of 1683, when Samuel Pepys, somewhat unannounced, arrived at Winchester College carrying a letter from one of the admirals of the Royal Navy, Lord Dartmouth, who asked Ken to serve as the chaplain for the fleet, for a fleet that Lord Dartmouth was going to be commanding, that was going on a secret expedition. And Ken was apparently given 2 days to prepare and depart. And he accompanied Mr. Pepys to Portsmouth. The fleet set sail in late August or in early August, and went to Tangier, which is in North Africa. Tangier had been a Portuguese possession, but when Charles II married his queen, Catherine of Braganza, who was a Portuguese princess, the city of Tangier was part of her dowry. That was very important to England. England very much wanted a port at the mouth of the Mediterranean for obvious strategic reasons, both to help them monitor and perhaps control shipping in and out of the Mediterranean Sea, and also along the South Atlantic coast. Unfortunately, Tangier was not a good choice. It was fairly constantly being harassed or besieged by the Moroccan Arabs and Berbers, who believed that the Portuguese had improperly taken it from them and wanted to repossess it. The port was not very good. The English spent hundreds of thousands of pounds trying to improve the port and extend a large mole or breakwater to make the port more useful. But finally, in 1683, the government decided that it simply wasn't worth the effort. And the secret mission of Lord Dartmouth's fleet was to go and destroy the harbor and evacuate the garrison and the few English civilians who lived there, and return them all to England. The process took from September of 1683, when they arrived, through the end of April of 1684. Ken was chaplain of the fleet, which meant that he was not only responsible for services for the commander, the admiral, but also supervised all of the chaplains in each of the individual ships as well. He found the job to be somewhat daunting. He was particularly appalled by the lax morality of the garrison that they found when they arrived. There was one of the stories was that approximately 75% of the soldiers in the garrison had sexually transmitted diseases, which they had all contracted from the same very attractive woman who lived in Tangier. Ken preached and Ken preached several sermons while he was there, according to Pepys's diary, which he kept. against the immorality of the garrison, which extended all the way up to the commander, but apparently had little effect in changing their conduct. He did make a friend from another member of the expedition, a lawyer by the name of William Trumbull, who had gone along, who along with Samuel Pepys was supposed to be adjudicating the claims of the civilians who were having to abandon their possessions and property in Tangier. Trumbull soon found that that task was not to his taste and begged Lord Dartmouth to permit him to return to England, and enlisted Ken to assist him in making his pleas. And in fact, Trumbull was permitted to return, which made him a lifelong friend of Ken's. The fleet left Tangier, having exploded the last portion of the mole or breakwater shortly before they departed, and returned to England at the end, in May of 1684. Ken resumed his duties at Winchester once again, and resumed his duties as royal chaplain. He found that unfortunately his brother-in-law Isaac Walton had died during his absence, and shortly after his return, his patron George Morley also died. This, however, opened up a new possibility for Bishop Ken, for Thomas Ken. The Bishop of Bath and Wells, Peter Muse, was translated from Bath and Wells to Winchester, which, as I said, was one of the most prestigious and wealthy bishoprics in England, which then left an opening at Bath and Wells. The position was open, and it was under the complete discretion of King Charles as to who would be promoted to that position. The story, which again may be apocryphal, is that when the appropriate person to take the position was being discussed with King Charles, he said that he wanted Bath and Wells to go to the little fellow who would not give poor Nellie a lodging. Whether King Charles actually recognized virtue in others that he did not practice himself is unknown, but certainly if Charles had felt any resentment for the way that Ken had treated his mistress, it was outweighed by Ken's reputation as a preacher and by the services that he had rendered to the crown at The Hague as chaplain to Princess Mary, and at Tangier as chaplain to the fleet, which was, by the way, the first time there had ever been a chaplain to an entire fleet. And apparently the Ken's performance was sufficiently successful that that became a regular position in the Royal Navy. In any event, here is the this is the letter that was sent to the dean and chapter at Wells, making Ken bishop, and at one time it had Charles's signature at the top, but apparently some autograph hunter cut that part of it off. You can just see a little bit of the squiggle that Charles would have put under there. But I guess of other interest is that the letter was actually written out and signed by William Trumbull, his friend from Tangier, who upon return, his early return to England, became one of the assistant secretaries of state. So he had one friend doing a service, or returning a service to another. Ken was consecrated as bishop on January 25th, 1685 at Lambeth Palace, consecrated by the Archbishop and a number of his fellow bishops. A week later, Ken was still in London when the news came that King Charles had become violently ill. Ken and several other bishops went to Charles's sickbed, and by all accounts, under Ken's leadership, spent much of the time that King Charles was awake in the next several days, trying to persuade him to take communion before he died. Charles put them off and made excuses, and finally his brother, Duke William, found an excuse to evacuate the room, brought in a Catholic priest who gave Charles communion in the last rites. This was kept secret, but secrets had a way of leaking out, and this became fairly widely rumored after Charles's death. This was somewhat of a scandal because the King of England was the head of the Church of England, and for him to leave this life as a practicing communicant of the Catholic Church certainly undermined the position both of the Church of England and of the king as leader of the church. And of course, that became even worse when James, Duke of York, became King James II of England, because, as I said before, James was an avowed Catholic. Nevertheless, James promised immediately upon the death of his brother that he would do everything in his power to support the Church of England and to preserve its rights as protected by law. And the church had supported James and his claim to the throne when, during Charles's reign, there was concern about a Catholic becoming king. But the church took the position that the laws of succession and the divine right under which kings ruled required that they honor those rules, and that they recognize James as king. And certainly his promises made during the early days of his reign that he would support and protect and preserve the church gave them comfort and led them to believe that he would be a good head of England and of the church. And in any event, they did support him. The coronation service of James took place at Westminster Abbey in April of 1685, and it was a rather peculiar coronation because while they had all of the pomp and ceremony, and Ken, in his position as Bishop of Bath and Wells, took his traditional post of escorting the king down the aisle to the coronation seat, but the coronation had to take place without a communion service because James, as a Catholic, could not take communion from the Archbishop of Canterbury. Nevertheless, at the coronation service, James again reiterated his promise to protect and preserve the church. Not everyone took him at his word, and those who believed that there had to be a Protestant king of England went to King Charles's oldest illegitimate son, James, Duke of Monmouth, and persuaded him that that if he went to England, that he would be able to raise an army and overthrow James, King James. At the same that happened at the same time, the Earl of Argyll in Scotland started a rebellion. The Earl of Argyll's rebellion faltered pretty quickly, and he was captured and executed. The Duke of Monmouth's rebellion started in the West Country, where Protestantism was very strong. He was only able to raise a few thousand totally untrained farmers and apprentices to support him, and his army was defeated at the Battle of Sedgemoor in July of 1685. He was captured and brought to London. Sedgemoor was in Somerset, which is the Diocese of Bath and Wells. Bishop Ken happened to be in London at the time because Parliament was in session, and he was attending Parliament as in his capacity as bishop. He was a member of the House of Lords. But James asked Bishop Ken and another one of the bishops, the Bishop of Ely, and two other priests to attend the Duke of Monmouth the night before his execution and at his execution. They attempted to get him to forswear, to renege on his positions. He would not go as far as they wanted him to go, and he was executed without having received the last rites or communion. And unfortunately, the headsman also didn't do a very good job. It took him 5 attempts, some say 8 attempts, to succeed in decapitating the poor Duke of Monmouth. After that, Bishop Ken returned to the diocese and was able to spend a few years trying to discharge his duties as bishop. He wrote several manuals of worship and prayer to be used by the clergy and by the people in his diocese. He made a habit of hosting Sunday dinner at the Bishop's Palace in Wells for a number of the indigent people in the area, when he would both give them a good meal and try to have discussions of spiritual matters with them. The Bishop's Palace today displays with pride a table which they claim was the table that Bishop Ken used for those dinners. But while this was going on and Bishop Ken was attempting to strengthen the church in his diocese, things were not going as well nationally for the church, because King James's view of what his promises to the church meant appeared to be very different from what the church expected from King James. It was fairly clear after a few months that James wanted to expand Catholicism in the in the realm and wanted to place as many Catholics in position of power and influence in the government and the army and the navy as he could. In order to do that, he had to dispense each of the office holders that he wanted to install from their statutory obligations to take an oath recognizing the King of England and no foreign person as head of the church, and obviously directed to keep people who believed in Catholicism and the Pope out of power, and requiring office holders to take communion in Church of England services. He used his dispensing power, and a test case was brought after King James appointed a number of judges that he thought would be favorable to his desires, and the court, in fact, affirmed the existence of a dispensing power, but the court did not go so far as to recognize that a king had the right to totally suspend a statute. King James also, he recognized that as a non-member of the Church of England, it probably wasn't appropriate for him to discipline members of the church, or priests and bishops in the church. So he appointed an ecclesiastical commission, which was made up of members of the church to do that. But they were all his supporters, and they pretty much did what he wanted. There were two cases that came before them that caused considerable concern for the church. One, the Ecclesiastical Commission suspended the Bishop of London because the Bishop of London had refused to suspend one of the priests in his diocese who had preached a sermon attacking Catholicism contrary to the instructions of the king that priests should stay away from doctrinal disputes in their sermons. And King James had also instructed the fellows of Magdalen College at Oxford to elect a new warden that he had chosen. The new warden, however, did not comply with could not be elected under the statutes of the college because he had not been a member of the college. And so the fellows of the college instead elected someone that who was properly qualified, as a result of which they were all summoned before the Ecclesiastical Commission and all removed from their positions as fellows of Magdalen College for their defiance of the king's wishes. This was all a real problem for the church, and it was further, the situation was further exacerbated because James and I'm going to, I see go past my hour, but I'll try to keep going for a little while, and if anyone wants to sign off, obviously they're free to do so. He decided that issuing individual indulgences or individual dispensation from the statutes was too cumbersome, and so he issued in the spring of 1687 a declaration of indulgence, saying that he was totally suspending the test acts that required the oaths and that office holders be communicants. and that he was doing so out of his desire to demonstrate toleration, not only for everyone outside of the Church of England. He did enlist William Penn, the Quaker and founder of the colony of Pennsylvania, who supported this because this also gave Quakers the right to serve in government and to worship as they pleased. Unfortunately, unfortunately probably isn't the right word. Penn was probably the only leading Protestant non-Anglican who supported the Declaration of Indulgence. Most of the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists and others recognized that this was being done as cover for continuing to appoint Catholics, and this was reinforced by the fact that very few non-Catholics who were the beneficiaries of the Declaration of Indulgence. And the unpopularity of James's position was also complicated by the fact that in the fall of 1685 in France, King Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had given Protestants in France the right to freely worship and participate in society. The revocation required all, made practicing Protestantism to be illegal in France, and required all Protestant ministers to depart the realm in 2 weeks. As a result of this, over 400,000 Protestants left France during this period, and this was a painful reminder to the English of their fears of what would happen if Catholics took over control of the government in England. In addition, or not in addition, at the same time, William of Orange in Holland, in the Netherlands, was watching what was going on in England. He was concerned. He was at war with France, and he was concerned that a Catholic England would join with France and make it impossible for him to win the war. In 1687 and 1688, he sent agents to England to inquire among disaffected nobles whether there was any possibility of an uprising against King James, which would result in in Princess Mary, William's wife, becoming queen, and thereby William becoming king. Meanwhile, James continued on. He was dissatisfied with the reaction of the Church of England to the Declaration of Indulgence that he had issued in 1687. So he reissued it in 1688 with instructions that every clergyman, every minister, every clergyman in England was required to read the Declaration from the pulpit during the Sunday service twice at the end of May of 1688 for all the parishes in London, and twice at the beginning of June for all the parishes outside of London. James was of the opinion that if it was read from the pulpits, this would give the people the impression that it was being adopted or favored by the church, and to the extent that the clergy refused to read it, he could attack them as being intolerant and strengthen his ties with the Protestant nonconformists. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Sancroft, struggled over what to do with this situation. He called all of the bishops that were in his province in southern England to come to London, as many as could. 6 of them came. The 7 of them sat down and drafted a petition to the king asking that he not require the reading of the declaration. Sancroft and the bishops were clever, though. They did not base their petition on a lack of tolerance for Catholics or for nonconformist Protestants. Instead, they based it on the idea that the declaration was illegal because it was contrary to statutes adopted by Parliament and approved by King Charles, and that therefore King James did not have the authority to overrule statutes, effectively rejecting the idea of the divine right of kings that would extend to permit a king unilaterally to countermand statutes adopted by Parliament. They drafted their petition on the 16th of May of 1688 and went to present their petition to the king. They did not. They were not joined by the archbishop, who pleaded illness, but the petition was in the archbishop's handwriting, so there was no question that he was also participating in it. The 6 bishops met with the king, took the king somewhat by surprise. He thought they were there on a friendly visit. He took the petition, read it, and blew a gasket, totally lost it, accused them of treason, which they all denied. They said, we're trying to help you. We're not trying to overthrow you. We're trying to guide you to do what is right. He dismissed them and told them that they would be hearing from him soon. And they did hear from him a couple of weeks later. He summoned them to appear on June 8th before the king in council. They were informed that they were going to be charged with seditious libel, which essentially was the publication of a statement that undermined the authority of the government. James made a very serious tactical mistake and ordered them to post bail. They refused to do so. And so the king was left with no choice but to order them to the Tower of London. The petition had been leaked immediately after it had been presented to the king, and the press had published it all over England and all over London. And when the bishops went to see the king on June 8th, there were crowds assembling, and the crowds honored the bishops as they were being transported to the tower. And the soldiers at the tower drank their health when they arrived, much to the dismay of the governor, who was one of the Catholics appointed by King James. During their stay at the tower, they were visited by many people asking for their blessing. They were in the tower for a week when they were brought out and brought back before, brought to court, the King's Bench, and read the indictment. They pled not guilty, and this time were permitted to be discharged without posting bail, so they were permitted to return. But that damage had already been done. They were already viewed as martyrs. The trial took place on June 29th. It lasted a full day. They almost got off on a technicality when the prosecution had trouble coming up with proof that the petition had been published, but finally established that. But then that meant that the question of whether or not the paper was a libel was submitted to the jury. And the defense took the position that because there was nothing in the petition that was incorrect, that it was in fact contrary to law for the king to assert a power to suspend statutes, that there was nothing libelous. The jury, there were 4 judges who presided, very different from our trials today, and they instructed the jurors on the law. They took differing positions on whether or not it was a libel, leaving it to the jury to decide. The jury deliberated overnight, and at 9 o'clock the next morning, returned a verdict of not guilty. The courtroom, which was full of supporters of the bishops, exploded with noise. That in turn spread throughout all of London. Bonfires were lit, celebrations were held throughout the city, and then in turn those spread throughout the country. Observing the verdict and the celebration which resulted from that, 7 of the people whom Prince William's agents had contacted about what could be done in England sent that very day a letter to Prince William suggesting that he might want to come and help resolve the unpleasant situation that existed in England at the time. William, not surprisingly, took them up on their invitation. It took a while for him to raise his fleet and army, and then there was adverse weather, but he finally landed with 15,000 troops at Torbay in Devon on the 5th of November, a very fortuitous day because that was also Guy Fawkes Day. He started marching towards London. At the same time, nobles in the north of England started raising troops to oppose King James. James got his army together and prepared to meet William's army on Salisbury Plain, but James became incapacitated by nosebleeds that were so severe he was unable to function. Then his leading officers, including John Churchill, who was later to become famous as the Duke of Marlborough, to desert, leaving the army without commanders. The final blow came when his younger daughter, Princess Anne, fled London along with the Bishop of London to join the rebels in the north. And her husband, who had been with the army, also deserted and left as well. James lost his nerve, fell back on London, and then as William's army approached, sent his wife and daughter to France, and then prepared to depart himself. Unfortunately, he was captured before he was able to disembark, and embarrassingly for him, was captured by people who did not recognize him, but recognized one of the people he was with as one of his supporters. I forgot to mention when I was talking about the trial that the trial was such a big deal that medals were struck honoring the 7 bishops. Here's one that I photographed that was in the archives at Wells Cathedral, and prints were printed honoring the bishops as though they were on an altar to be honored as such. Anyway, the irony of the situation was that although Bishop Ken and many of the other bishops, 4 of the other bishops, had by their petition provided a catalyst for the downfall of James, they really did not support his downfall. When William came into London, he let it be known that he wouldn't be all that upset if James were permitted to escape again. And James did, in fact, escape a second time, and this time successfully fled to France. Then a convention was summoned. There couldn't be a parliament because parliaments could only be summoned by a king. A convention was summoned, which tried to address the issue of what to do in the absence of the king. Bishop Ken and the Archbishop of Canterbury and several others took the position that they would be willing to accept that James had abandoned and possibly could be said to be temporarily insane, and therefore that a regency should be declared, and they wouldn't have any problem with William and Mary being declared regents. That really wasn't a practical situation, and those who were politically savvy recognized that. Parliament declared that James had abdicated the throne and that William and Mary should be recognized as co-sovereigns. The situation had been complicated, and I omitted this by the fact that the Queen, shortly before the 7 bishops' trial, gave birth to a son, which meant that Mary was no longer the heir to the throne. Parliament essentially dealt with that complication by coming up with alternative facts and deciding that the son couldn't possibly have been a legitimate child. Modern historians recognize that this was fake news and that in fact the baby was legitimate, but difficult times call for difficult decisions, and Parliament simply ignored that problem by recognizing, by refusing to acknowledge his legitimacy. As usurpers often do, William and Mary felt a little uncomfortable on the throne, and they required a new oath of allegiance, a new oath of loyalty to them personally. Thomas Ken wrestled long and hard about what to do, and finally decided he couldn't take that oath. Neither could a number of other bishops and about 200 clergy. In 1691, they were declared by Parliament to have forfeited their positions as bishops and rectors of churches, and were replaced. This created a schism in the church, because you had two people claiming to be the rightful bishops of various places. Ken really wasn't interested in maintaining a schism, but at the same time, he didn't recognize the authority of his successor. But he did not actively oppose the situation. Instead, he retired to the house, very nice house, of one of his friends, Viscount Weymouth. And he lived there for most of the next 20 years. And actually, I see we've pretty much lost our audience. I don't know whether you want me to keep going at this point for the recorded.
Well, as you wish. No, we're still here.
All right. I was afraid this was going to go on too long. Anyway, I apologize. He did try to keep a low profile. In 1703, there was a huge storm in England, so huge that it was written up 100 years, 200 years later in Scientific American. One of the effects of the storm was that it caused some of the chimneys at the Bishop's Palace at Wells to collapse, killing Bishop Ken's successor. Queen Anne, who was then queen, offered Ken the opportunity to take his position back, but Ken declined, pleading age and infirmity, thereby avoiding the more difficult question of whether he would have been willing to take the oaths of allegiance to Queen Anne. But Queen Anne then turned and offered the position to George Hooper, his friend who had been his predecessor as chaplain to Princess Mary. Ken agreed to that, and so much so that he agreed to waive his future claims on the bishopric. This upset some of the other schismatics who wanted him to continue to defy the church authority, but Ken really had no interest in doing that. Ken finally became increasingly ill. He died at Longleat in March of 1711. To circle back to the Doxology, this is the text of what the original version of the Doxology looked like when it was first published by Ken in 1695. Nobody knows when the Doxology was originally written. It was the last verse of 3 hymns that Ken wrote, a morning hymn, portions of which now appear as hymn number 11 in the 1982 hymnal. There was an evening hymn, portions of which now appear as hymn number 43. And there was a midnight hymn, which didn't make the cut for the 1982 hymnal at all, which was intended to be reassurance for those who awoke in the middle of the night with nightmares. All 3 of those hymns ended with this verse. nobody also knows what music Ken intended the hymns to be sung to. His great nephew, who was his first biographer, said that Ken was an accomplished composer, and wrote some of his own music, and was also accomplished both at playing the lute and playing the organ. But we don't know whether he composed music to go with this or not. His 19th century biographers take the position that the original music was Tallis's 8th tune, which I will play here. This is, in fact, the tune that is used for the evening hymn, hymn 43. So there's at least a long tradition that it has been associated with Ken's music. The most common setting of the Doxology, the last verse, is Old Hundredth, which was the setting that was used at what I played at the beginning of this, and that was used for a hymn written by Isaac Watts earlier in the. No, was he later? I think he was in the 18th century. At some point, someone tacked this text onto the end of one of Isaac Watts' hymns. It's now found at hymn 380 in the 1982 prayer book, or 1982 hymnal. It's almost certain that was not the original music that Ken used, but even though that tune has been around since the 16th century, nevertheless, that's the setting which has become most popular and is used by not only the Episcopal Church, but by Protestant churches of all denominations. And that concludes my my prepared remarks.
Well, Bruce, thank you very, very much, because you think about a text like this that we're so familiar with, and I think it has the danger of becoming kind of background material, or sort of something that's so familiar that it's sort of a plain vanilla kind of feature of our liturgy. But you've reminded us of the great sweep of history that Thomas Ken was very, very. He was certainly caught up in the midst of so many of these events that you've outlined so brilliantly for us. So thank you very much. This has been splendid.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I could have said so much more, but I'm glad I didn't. But thank you again for the opportunity, and have a good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you very much.